Um, yes, hello and welcome, and thank you very much for attending our session today, and also to all three of you for participating in the panel. As we have just heard, the climate crisis is real and its impacts can be felt and seen more and more all over the globe. But as some people in some parts of the world are experiencing it really directly and are suffering from it, in some other parts of the world, it seems like we are looking at it more from a distance, right? So we want to figure out how can we encourage people to take it serious and to stand up for actions. And so we want to figure out how storytelling is a tool for that and can be a better tool in the future. So facts and news and media reporting is all around us, and sometimes the link seems to be missing to really feel a personal and emotional connection to all those information that we are receiving. At the Human Rights Film Festival Berlin, we already had the pleasure to host the Climate Story Lab back in 2020, which is an initiative by Doc Society. Also, Michael, one of our panelists today, took part in that. So I'm really happy you're here at the panel with us today. And it was a wonderful 3-day experience where NGO members, activists, and storytellers came together to work on those different approaches and figure out solutions and how we can use storytelling. At the Human Rights Film Festival in October this year, we are also hosting some sessions and workshops, so you are welcome to visit us in autumn. And you can also find more information on that on our website. Also right after this session, we are hosting a workshop also about the Climate Storytelling Lab, and we are going to set guidelines and also learn how to work with images and strong messages to develop claims and send messages about the climate crisis. So you're welcome to join that. So today we are looking from like 3 different perspectives and approaches on the topic. So we have a scientific, an artistic, and a journalistic point of view. So I'm more than happy to welcome my 3 panelists. We have Sarah Schumann, who works as a journalist for more than 10 years and also as editorial manager and consultant. You worked for Tagesspiegel, Gruner & Jahr, SWR, and also this year you published your first book, Klartext Klima. So welcome very much. And thank you for taking part.
Thank you for having me.
Then we have Louis Akanji, who is the managing director from the Hot or Cool Institute, which is a public think tank exploring the intersection between society and sustainability. He was also executive director at SEED, promoting entrepreneurship for sustainable development, and also a director for sustainable consumption and production at the Think Tank Institute for Global Environmental Strategies, just to name a few of your projects and achievements. So welcome, Louis. And last but not least, we have Michael, who is the founder and managing director at Wort in Herzschlag, and developing and showing theater plays like the Mittelmeermonologe or Asylmonologe. And this year, in November, also premiering his new project, The Climate Monologues. Welcome, Michael. So let's dive right into the topic. Louis, I would be interested in learning more about what storytelling plays, like what kind of role storytelling plays in your everyday work, and also what are your greatest takeaways in that context from previous projects you've done?
All right. Thank you so very much. It's for those of you who are here, it's wonderful to see you. We don't usually get the typical audience we get when we talk about climate change is either politicians or policymakers and fellow scientists. So it's wonderful to have a panel that is an audience that is a little bit broader. And I have a bit more of a cry for help in telling a good story than actually telling a good story. So I'll start with a really bad story. We're still in somewhat of a pandemic with the COVID. And one of the interesting things that happens, and I'm going to put in a number here, is at the end of the first year of the pandemic, after the lockdown, after you couldn't take public transportation, after you couldn't visit your grandma and all those things, scientists analyzed and said, greenhouse gases dropped by about 7% that year. And you could look at this 2 ways, right? One way of looking at it is all that pain not being able to meet each other, not being able to go out for a beer, not even being able to go out to a park. And the furthest you could go sometimes was just your balcony. All that pain for a 7% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. But you could also look at it from the other side and go, oh my gosh, this is the steepest drop we've had in a year in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And in fact, this is what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change recommended that several years ago back, that we need to drop by about this amount every year if we need to stay at a sustainable level, if we need to get the balance, the planet in a balance. This is a tale of two perspectives, and it illustrates something at the heart of what we're not doing well about climate change. Typically, as a scientist, you would end at a 7% drop. But then you get the public going, the pain, the people, the love, all these things are missing in this 7%, which is something we typically do not talk about. The story of climate change is a story of a collapsing society right before our eyes. It's not that everyone will die. No, it's just that increasingly our lives will get very difficult. And at the very heart of it is a story of inequalities. It's a story of inequality between a very wealthy small group. This is the top 10% of the world that is causing more than 50% of the pollution, the greenhouse gas pollution, and the bottom, that wealthy group, and the poor group, the bottom 50%, that is causing less than 15% of it, but happens to live in countries where the impact is highest. It is a story of inequalities between men and women. Men who primarily are in decision-making positions, who have constructed the world as we know today, and who drive the primary consumption habits, versus women who are sort of the nourishing and caretaking part and are not allowed in decision-making. It's a story of inequalities between the global north that extracts a lot of resources from the south, and the global south that is suffering the consequences and is not participating in this decision-making. The story of climate change, the story of unsustainability, is a story of a very twisted society that has got its values all wrong. And the sooner we start reconciling this, the sooner this narrative gets into the text that we're talking about, the easier it is for us to grasp it. And it's also not a story of tomorrow. It's not a story of the future generations. It's a story of now. We're seeing it increasingly happening. About 30 years ago, scientists were predicting that what is happening now will be happening in 2040. We're seeing it happening, not only happening, but happening faster than was expected in places that were not predicted and displaying in patterns that we cannot even register or coordinate. And it's not as far away a story as we would like to make it seem. And one of the wonderful things I've been discussing with Sarah here is, well, it's not so wonderful, isn't it? Is it? The last 2 years is full of scientists waking up to the fact that they're not just generating numbers and putting them out in the public, but they're also part of a society that is facing very dire future. And you're seeing vast amounts of depression across the scientific community because of a realization of the fact that it's not just putting out numbers and sitting on the sidelines of it. So climate change is really a story that brings at the forefront all the very nasty things of a society that we've constructed, and we're looking at it straight in the eye. So my plea then is for those of you who are better at communication than scientists, for those of you who are journalists, who are writers, who are documentary makers, founders, and so on, please help weave this narrative into whatever it is that you're doing, because we've been terrible at communicating it.
Thank you very much, Louis. Yeah, I think that's also why it's so important to come together in like such a panel, such a great format where we are here today to share those stories and background information. And Sarah, like you also like wrote in your book about the responsibility of media. And I think you said like if the climate crisis doesn't make it into the daily news, like the Tagesschau, it actually can't be that serious. But I mean, we are seeing the pictures in the media, in the news, like wildfires, floods. But so I'm wondering, in your opinion, why is that not enough? And how does the media landscape also have to change in order to take it to, or to play like a more crucial role in fighting the climate crisis?
Yeah, it's true. Sure, we do see wildfires and droughts and floodings and stuff, but we don't see everything that is there, right? There are so many areas in the world that do have so grave things. Yeah, you see coming from climate change already, and we barely even hear about this. And there's another dimension that we don't really understand, and it's what I would say that the first thing you have to do if you want to tell a story is to understand it yourself. That was a very basic fact I even try to teach young journalists when you're just like having a police story or something. You just really have to understand it. You have to find out like what happened, and then you can write it down and not just like ask questions and then tick boxes. And for the climate crisis, it's much more complicated because, yeah, like you said, scientists didn't always do the best job in communicating it, and so many of my colleagues, I would say, are also in this numbers and math part stuck somewhere, and we didn't really realize as a society, but also not as journalists enough at this point, and also as scientists. I often do speak to scientists who are like, yeah, okay, actually, I just get it like 2 years ago that it's like real. And so if we don't transport this in our reporting like every day, and if we don't make this visible, so it's like really, really easy for everybody else just to say, climate change, I don't want to read this now, right? We have this pandemic, it's bad enough. We have this war, it's bad enough. So now I'm not going to click on this article about climate change. And what we have to do is that we have to see this structural problem and then make all these connections that are there transparent. So this is our job as journalists, I would say. And we can't just have a news that, okay, there's a GDP growth after the COVID pandemic and this is great. No, there has to be the second part that says, and this is really a big problem because we didn't decouple GDP growth from emissions now, and this really just makes it very improbable that we can meet any emission targets, and this means we're just destroying our livelihoods. And if we don't do so, if we just say, okay, there's a GDP growth, yay, everybody is like, okay, yeah, and doesn't really get the connection if we don't make it transparent. So these are the most important ways, in my view, to really tell the story as journalists.
Yes, yeah, definitely. So to give more context and a bigger picture should be also a role of the media landscape, right? So Michael, I'm interested in your perspective, but maybe first of all, could you just briefly explain your way of working and also in regard to your previous plays, which role storytelling had in that, before we look at your new play?
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm doing Verbatim Theater. That means I'm doing interviews with the protagonists of my documentary theater plays. These interviews often take 1 or 2 full days. And then I'm only shortening those interviews. It's important to mention that I'm not adding anything. I'm not inventing anything. I'm also keeping the original wording of the interviewers. So it's word by word verbatim theater. And by doing so, it's possible to tell stories that are rather invisible. So each discourse has aspects which are quite known and other aspects which are quite unknown. And I always try to find the protagonists who are telling those invisible stories. So, for example, in the case of the Asylum Monologues, which premiered 2011, at that time, very little was known about why people apply for asylum but did not get asylum. Or when I did the NSU monologues in 2016, there was a lot of knowledge about the perpetrators, but there was quite little knowledge about the families affected. And in a very similar way, I'm now, as I'm working on the climate monologues, I'm focusing on stories of people who are affected in the countries of the global south.
So yeah, you just mentioned the climate monologues, and in the climate story lab we hosted in 2020 that I mentioned, you made this connection to someone in Bangladesh, right? So you visited Bangladesh, where end of May, sadly, 2 million people experienced the worst floods for nearly 2 decades. So this must have been an intense experience. So what was your experience actually in Bangladesh, and also what impact does it have on your play and also on theater plays on a larger scale connected to the topic?
So when I was there, I again did a lot of interviews. Interviews with different people in different cities and regions. But the storyline that I heard was very often quite similar. So you can say that a typical storyline of a person living in the coastal area in Bangladesh goes like that. So life was rather okay. So people could feed themselves. They had a little house which was good enough to live in. They owned a piece of land where they could do rice culture or any other kind of agriculture. They lived in villages where life was more or less intact. When the next generation became old enough, they founded their own families, and the parents were able to feed their children and to send the children to school. Now, the question that I asked by far the most often when I was there was, how was your life before Cyclone Isla, and how was your life after Cyclone Isla? So Cyclone Isla was a very strong tropical cyclone which happened in 2009. And in an irreversible way, it changed the lives of tens of thousands of people. So not alone were many houses destroyed. Not alone, the day itself was extremely traumatizing for the people there. A day about life and death. The long-term consequences were even much bigger. So that means that the cyclone pushed the seawater into the country and salinated the soil. So after that, in huge areas of the coastal region, any form of agriculture was literally impossible, and the drinking water was contaminated. And so the life that people have been having and are still having since that is a Sisyphus work. So they are trying to rebuild their lives, and when it maybe works at least to some degree, another cyclone came. I also ask always the question, how many cyclones did you experience in your lifetime? So the typical answer of a middle-aged person was, in the first half of my life, I experienced like 1, maybe 2 cyclones. But in the second half of my life, I experienced 6 or 7 or 8 cyclones. And that clearly shows that these are not only stories about some natural disasters. These are surely stories about climate change. And we just have to tell these stories.
Yes, thank you. That's really interesting, and I can imagine that it was like a really intense experience also for you doing those interviews, and that also shows again, like coming back to what we talked before, getting this context and those little stories to understand also the bigger picture, right? So what we have seen in the media here was like a really monothematic reporting in the past 2 years. We had the Corona crisis, Ukraine. So in German media, sometimes we have the feeling that those devastating effects are not really visible in the reporting, and most of the time it's not really connected to this bigger context and the bigger picture. So also the urgency of the topic can't be really understood. That's also what you're mentioning in your book. So why do you think that actually is? Why can't we do that better?
I think it's again about understanding, because I'm pretty frustrated about the discourse right now because we do see many crises which are interlinked, and if we just like gonna start to solve them, we just like gonna start solving this crisis altogether. And so like even our lives could be better if we just start on working on that. But like we're really so brainwashed, that we don't really see these interconnections, and we're just like still telling ourselves that GDP growth is going to make us all rich enough to buy us out of that. And this just isn't possible. And but it's like so difficult to let go of this. I moderated a panel on Wednesday with Maya Göppel on degrowth, and I was just like saying at the beginning, okay, to be totally honest, 2 years ago, I wouldn't have shown up because I thought, okay, this is all nice what you're talking about, but it's just not very realistic. And you're just like ideological, biased, good people who just don't want to, I don't know. And then it took me like seeing how bad the climate catastrophe will be and what it has to do with my life, and understanding that the climate change isn't just the only crisis we're in, but we really cross like several planetary boundaries, and that, okay, maybe we can decouple growth and emissions, but we can't decouple resource use and growth. And so we really just have to start and stop all the things we do that destroy our livelihoods and just start the good things, and they will multiply as well. And so we still would have a tiny chance of having some level of sustainable life for as many people as possible if we would just start doing it. But before starting, we have to see it and acknowledge that there are so much things we didn't understand till now. And this is also an important part of the story, I would say, to tell, because I, as I said, talked even to many scientists who are now like, okay, actually, I just get how bad this is, and I just now feel the emotional connection. And this just also really changes our view on what is possible and what not. Because beforehand, I was always like, yeah, this Agrarwende and Energiewende and so on, this sounds all very nice, and I would be happy if we would make it till my pensions. And now I just know, okay, we have to do this in the next 8 years, or I won't have much of a pension. And just like to understand this and just say it, and to make also this changing of minds as a process transparent, and just admit that, okay, I was kind of blind, I didn't see it, I didn't understand it, makes it more easy for other people to say, okay, wait, did I really get it? Did I really just understand what they are talking about, and just like get into it? Because it's not like I've been this eco-loving person all my life and I was fighting for whatever. Yeah, okay, I try to not use plastic bags or something, but that's it. And now I really look on it differently.
Yes. So yeah, it seems like we are losing the audience at some point, right? And so, Louis, do you also see it that way? And I mean, that we have a crisis is clear, and it seems difficult to understand why we are just not acting more on it. So also in a more, seeing it in a more constructive way, what needs to be changed that change can actually start, but also looking from a decision-making level. So also that we can take that audience with us.
I really like something you said. It reminded me of this is a social scientific concept called distancing. This is a phenomenon where you do not see the immediate repercussions of something that you do. It's what happens when you put your trash, you just take it out and you put it, and then it disappears the next morning. It's what happens when you get tens of plastic bags and you don't see them anymore, and the ocean and the turtle have to deal with it. It is what happens when you just turn on the tap and you see water coming and you don't know where it's coming from. This is what we've done with this problem of climate change, of biodiversity decline, and so on. We're practicing distancing. And in this case, what we've done is not only distancing, we've sent out all the potential solutions to technology. We see it as more of a technical problem than a problem of our behavior, of our consumption and production. But at the very core of this is a question of our values as a society. What kind of tomorrow do we want to be? What levels of inequality are acceptable? How much do you need to consume as an individual to feel satisfied? And how much of that consumption involves taking away from other people? What levels of pollution are acceptable for future society? How many degrees should your grandkids or your great-grandkids be allowed to have? Which types of technologies should we invest in? This is a question of our values as a society. So what we do is we very carefully externalize and we distance that and we put it somewhere else and we say technology is going to solve the problem. And while we are today, let's dance and celebrate and buy more stuff, right? It's a fantastic thing because at the Horoku Institute, what we do is we say we put people and science at the heart of the sustainability transition, because you can't just talk about the science and the technology. You really do need to talk about people. How do we do this? We have this approach called 1.5 degree lifestyles. And what it's actually trying to do is see the impact of changes in lifestyles and the systems that shape lifestyles on climate change. The things we notice in there are quite a bit terrifying, and I can understand why people are overwhelmed. Just the average footprint of a German citizen from transportation is the entire footprint of the lifestyle of someone in Bangladesh, as where you have been. These are the disparities we're seeing. But Germany is talking about solving this from a technology perspective. It's not talking about solving it from a consumption perspective. It's talking about solving it from an externalization perspective. So just pay some money and get trees planted over there. Go get gas from somewhere else. It's not talking about reducing its consumption or reducing its sort of the extractive nature of its economy. So we have this very perverse thing called GDP, which our governments keep engineering, and essentially what it means is, in a very simplistic way, it's buy more stuff. But it only works because all our systems are designed to encourage this. And somewhere, this is going to break. What is that breaking point? And what is that consequence? What is the consequence of that breaking point? The more we push this, the more dangerous, the more consequential that breaking point will be. And so we should have started addressing this yesterday, changing our behavior yesterday, changing the value orientation of our economy yesterday, changing our political systems yesterday, changing our neighbors yesterday, dumping our cars yesterday, but we can't. Why? Because the values that primarily drive our society are geared towards growth, towards our comfort, and are externalizing all the problems to people in Bangladesh, in South Africa, in Colombia. It's never us. We live in a little nice, cozy fortress where we can, we don't see the immediate effects. And our great-grandkids are a few decades away, so who really cares about them, right? Let's party now.
We actually see a lot of them, but we don't try to see and look at it. We just close our eyes like every day. I mean, I was like walking through mines like in the first days that were hot like some weeks ago, and the trees were already having their leaves crumbled and falling down because it didn't have enough water in Germany like in 2022. So it's just also kind of absurd how we try to tell ourselves that we will be safe and can build this fortress, because it's just not possible.
I should quickly add here that for lots of people, and I would even argue that for a majority of people, it's not that people don't want to make a difference. It's just that sometimes the system is so overwhelming that it becomes difficult. You do not, just as we talk about distancing, you do not see the impact of buying one less plastic paper, or you do not see the impact of switching off your lights. And to a certain extent, although these habits are good, they do not really go to the heart of the problem. They really do not go there. The magnitude, the urgency and scale of this problem is such that you cannot do it as individuals and just as neighbors. You really do need to push your governments and businesses to start transforming the damn economy and system that is perpetuating the context within which individuals and households are making these decisions. That is part of the problem here. People are so overwhelmed that they're almost in a paralyzed state by this. And the more overwhelming the problem gets, the more the governments try to pretend that it's people that are going to solve this problem. The more businesses pretend that it's consumers that are going to solve this problem, the more overwhelming it gets, because like I said, should have started yesterday. And the more we postpone it, the breaking point, the consequence of the breaking point is going to be even more damaging.
Yes, definitely. And it's just more like a shift of responsibilities, right? And how do we reach the audience and educate audiences? And Michael, you have reached diverse audiences with your previous plays. So looking at the climate monologues, what is different with this play? And also, were there any challenges that you have experienced when developing your new play? And what kind of challenges?
Yeah, I would say there are quite a lot of challenges. I'm in the middle of working on it, so I even don't know what the outcome will be. I think it's important that we understand the difference between content on one hand and a story on the other hand. So in order to tell a compelling story that resonates to a big audience, we have to fulfill different conditions. And a story must have several elements. And I want to just give a few examples. So I'm basically quoting some basic rules of storytelling, of a textbook of script writing. And I'm comparing this to my experiences so far as a climate storyteller looking for interview partners. So example 1, a story needs an inciting incident. That means we first tell about the normalcy of the protagonist of the story, and then one or a few events are happening that triggers the start of the story. So when I'm telling this story I mentioned earlier about a cyclone that's happening, I actually do have this inciting incident. The cyclone itself is the inciting incident. But what, for example, if I tell a story about a drought where things are changing, where the change is happening over the course of 20, maybe 30 years, we might not have an inciting incident in terms of storytelling. So it's a very gradual process that is going on, and this is much more difficult to narrate. Example number 2, we need exposition to have a good story. So before we tell the story, we have to fully understand the world in which the story is happening. So coming back to my example from earlier, so when I'm telling that the soil gets salinated by the seawater that is coming through the cyclone, yes, we do understand what that means, but as this is so far away from our own life experience, do we really fully understand the significance of not having soil to do agriculture? It's not part of our life world. We go to the supermarket if we are hungry. So it's very, and even if you understand this cognitively, it takes quite a lot of information. It takes quite a lot of context so that we really also emotionally understand the significance of that element of the story. And this, by the way, is also why I'm quite happy that I can do this very long interviews, because then I can get the context. And it's similar what you said, that we first have to understand the story ourselves before we are able to narrate the story. Example number 3. Stories usually have a lot of turning points. That means the direction of the protagonist of the story significantly changes. Again, when I compare this to the previous human rights stories I worked on, it seems to me that it's in a lot of cases more difficult to find those turning points when I'm looking for climate stories. These failures or these successes that people experience when they are struggling against the climate crisis. So to sum it up, I'm surely not implying that it's impossible to do climate storytelling. That's exactly what I'm doing. But now 5 months before the premiere of the play, and as I have already been working quite a while on that issue, and if I compare it to the other human rights issues I've worked before, it's for sure, for me personally, more time-consuming to look for these stories in other places of the world. And it's quite a challenge to like I said, to transform this content into stories that have the possibilities to reach a larger audience.
Mm-hmm. Okay, really interesting. Yeah, and I mean, Louis, I think also for you during your career, it was also an important topic of like how to reach and influence people with stories. And from your personal opinion, what does like really good and excellent storytelling is about? What are like your major takeaways from it?
One of my major takeaways is that my colleagues and I have been pretty horrible at telling a story. Otherwise, everyone would be quite clear about where the problem is right now. But perhaps what could be a bit instructive is the shift in positions have taken over time. For quite a while, I try to tell this story from a resource issue. So I analyze it. Well, we have scarcity of resources and there's X amount of greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere. I was doing this kind of technical analysis, which, the tools we have only allow us to think as machines. Yeah, we use integrated assessment models and other mathematical models to do this work. What that does is it brings a frame that is interesting for governments to use, but it doesn't necessarily put people in there. And so even if you say a government is made up of people. Or you say a businesses are made up of people. So then I started realizing part of it is the angle from which we're telling the story. We're telling this story from the angle of resources, of metals. We're telling this story from the angle of methane or carbon dioxide. I want to switch perspectives and tell the story from the perspective of people. And this is what we're now doing at the Horoko Institute. We're looking at it from a lifestyle perspective. And that is why we're using lifestyle carbon footprint, because then it really tells the story of your life versus my life. It tells the story of the impact of the things that you do versus the impact of the things that other people are doing. This tends to be very effective in actually getting people. When people see their footprint, they go, wow. But it also does something else. It just gets them to say, the recent analysis we did on 1.5 degree lifestyle shows that someone in Germany right now needs to reduce emissions from their consumption by more than 90% compared to where they need to be by 2050. This is the magnitude of it. And if you actually animate this, you see it dropping substantially to some tiny thing like this. It's hard for an individual to even imagine this. Where you have to start connecting the dots is putting where you are within the transportation system. If you want to ride a bicycle, but it's unsafe because you'll get hit by a Ferrari on the road, you're not going to ride a bicycle. If you want to live in an eco-efficient house and all the houses that are for rent in the market are hitting out the balcony instead of being insulated, you have no choice. You're not going to freeze in the winter. If you want to consume healthy food, but all the options that you have in Lidl, exploiting farmers from Brazil and bringing unethically produced food here, which is unhealthy, you're not going to starve to death. You need to connect people to the context that makes these choices available to them. And this is suddenly resonating with people because then it makes them ask the question, Lidl, what the heck? Or government, what on earth? We can't do this all alone. And governments are also suddenly realizing we're not just going to calculate these emissions from the sky downwards. We're going to build it bottom up. How are our citizens feeling about this? And all these net zero strategies that we hear, where are the aspirations of citizens? Where are their hopes and dreams? What would tomorrow look like? If you live in a sustainable society, how would it be to travel from one place to another? And because governments have not articulated a vision of what a healthy, sustainable life could be, it's just lost somewhere in translation. Right? So it's we have lots of trigger points, but we're allocating responsibility in areas where people have very little agency. I promise I wouldn't use technical terms today. I've gone back to one. Where people don't really have the full power to do something. Translated in very lay terms, the only way people will really end up doing something if governments don't respond is a revolution. And we can see that boiling in society because people are getting increasingly restless. Mm-hmm. It's not only in developing countries, it is also in developed countries. people are beginning to wake up to it and asking, what about our tomorrow? And who is benefiting from this system? Why do you keep talking about investments in technology when it's those that are already rich that are going to invest in these technologies and get richer? And we see this gap between the rich and the poor growing even bigger. Again, it's a question of our values, and it's the question of who we are as a people. It's not a technical problem.
I would like to add something to both of them. I think we as journalists should really stop telling climate change from the perspective of icebergs and foreign countries. And I'm always a little torn when I say this, because I really do care about climate justice, and I really am outraged when I just realized what we did to Global South. Because beforehand, I said I was also one of the persons who was like, okay, this is kind of a theoretical problem, and I guess we're going to solve it, because if we don't, we're just going to be silly, and nobody can be interested in this. And then just at some point, I understood that, oh, we're not even trying to solve this, right? And so I'm always trying to be very transparent about my process of becoming aware of how bad this crisis is, because for me it started I was always kind of this eco guy and driving bike, blah blah blah, and then in 2018 I just realized through an article, so journalism works, about the plastic pollution problem, that it's really as bad as I always thought, but people were telling me that I'm just going to recycle and then everything's going to be okay, and I was always kind of skeptical. And then I just read this article, okay, just 1/3 in Germany is really recycled, and we are already the best in the world, kind of. And then a lot of this is just burned, and the pollution of it just goes into empty salt stocks in Germany till they are full of really poisonous stuff and so on, and the rest we just ship to Asia, and there we don't really care what happens to it, but it might land in the oceans, and it's not the Asian guys who just pollute the oceans. And was oh fuck, okay, I don't want to be part of this anymore. And then I just tried to read up, and I just realized what I could have known before but didn't really realize was okay, fast fashion, same problem. Agriculture industry, same problem, stuff like this. Okay, I'm telling myself that one long haul flight a year is really okay, right? Probably not. And then I ended up reading up on climate, and then I just realized, okay, we already really trashed the Global South. And then I was okay, I stopped flying, I changed a lot of everything. But then Greta Thunberg just appeared, and I was okay, now the school people are just gonna solve the problem, so that I don't really have to care about it. But I kept on reading because I just understood, okay, it's more grave than I thought. And it took me 2 years that I really read about climate change every day to understand that it's not a problem of my children's children, but of me and my parents. I'm an Aussie, so my parents are pretty young, and we are gonna see so much shit happening, and I didn't know. And then I was really shocked, because I was a journalist at this point for about 10 years, and I was working on all these editorial teams and even leading them, and I had no idea. And I was okay, how could that happen? And then just realized, okay, I never had one editorial team meeting where we had a clear and realistic conversation about climate change. And this is the point where I try to start it and tell my story, and tell people that we can't keep on telling the climate change story with foreign countries, but we have to start to, in our articles about buying houses, deciding to have babies, stuff like this, that we always pretend that our lives were going to go on for the next 30 or 50 years like it was now. And it's not the case. And we're just really distancing us, and so we're making it very easy for the rest of the world to just don't get the connection, the systemical thing that you just described, where that there is a connection. And so I'm trying to tell the personal story.
Yeah, that's important. I think what we all can agree on, what you all have mentioned, that it's so important to as we are so disconnected and far away from everything, like as it seems, to have those personal stories and really seeing like humans are actually suffering from the crisis, and to have those stories that really like make this connection and some kind of emotional link to it, right? And also at the Human Rights Film Festival Berlin, we had like really great discussions on constructive journalism, and we had Ellen Heinrichs there who gave like a really blazing speech about also how negative headlines are like really like we are losing people with like those negative headlines, and why also the style of reporting is so important. And so I mean, you already touched it, but like in your opinion, why is constructive journalism, like, is it an important tool, and how can we use it or not?
It is really important, and also there some story about me just realizing what an arrogant asshole I was before, because I was like in these more like quality media's editorial teams, and when constructive journalism was coming up, people in these teams were like, yeah, that's really something for people who have enough time to do this, right? Because the world is so bad and we're just going to report it as it is. And only in the moment that I realized how bad the climate crisis already is, I understood why constructive journalism is so essential. Because like if we just start reporting realistically how bad the situation is, like everybody's just gonna get crazy, I guess. So we can't stop there. Also because when we just do criticize everything, like, okay, no, it's not possible to have the renewable energy, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, no, we have to make one step further and ask, like, how is it possible? Because there are solutions. And it might not be easy and perfect, but there are ways. So this is our job. And I think I'm really convinced that this is our job also in the democracy, that we as journalists are the ones who really guide the public discourse. We aren't the only ones who have a say in it, but we are really important for having a realistic public discourse on what is possible and what not. And if we just like keep on like writing, no, we can't do this and we can't do the Verkehrswende and we can't do the other thing, la la la, we won't never start to act. So I think it's really important, but I would disagree on the bad headlines, because I think we need some more to just understand how bad the situation is. And if we understand how bad the situation is, this really changes our perspective on what is a feasible way to go and what is possible and what not. So,
okay.
Yeah. Could I add something to this? I've talked about values before, and I think this is what you've said is really quite important here. If we are to change our values, we need to change the principles of our institutions. So school system, journalism, political systems, and all of this. We need to completely reorientate them, rewrite the rules that govern them, and the playbook around all of this. That is how you start changing the values of a society. And I think journalism has a wonderful thing to do here. But it's also those of you that are playwrights, those of you that are putting together documentaries or the stage plays, or those that are writing, I don't know, poems and everything, the artists and so on. We need the sort of a wake up, a reorientation of our values, to an extent that it's almost impossible for an individual to think about. And this is one of the strong points of what we need getting into a future. A large amounts of recapacitating, of capacity building, not just in thinking about a radically different life, but in being able to reimagine what it means to live a good life and in future. That capacity to reimagine is not just in the hands of, it's not just with numbers and so on. It's in the hands of those people that are doing communication and that are doing very effective communication. And we need a lot more of that than just throwing scientific numbers and science around.
Yeah. I think that was already like a really good statement to round that off. But maybe just like for all three of you and for our audience, what would you recommend our audience? Like, probably have a lot of people here working with words and text. So what would you say everyone who works in that field and on the issue of climate crisis should bear in mind? Maybe like you can just jump in, whoever has a recommendation for our audience.
Well, I apologize if I do not do a recommendation, but I'm using this stage to announce that I'm still looking for stories for the play, and I've been doing this for quite a while. So as there are many people who might also work on that field, if there's any story from somewhere in the world which you heard, which was touching to you, then approach me and tell me, because I'm in the middle of collecting these stories for the play. Thanks.
Great. Yeah. Anything else you would like to add?
Yeah, I kind of said it before, but the first thing is like really immerse yourself into information and story and stuff and try to understand this. I don't want to advertise my book, but I really, as I said, when I just found out how bad the situation is, I was like, how the fuck does it come that we don't talk about it? And how is it possible that scientists communicate so differently about it? Because at first I was like, okay, am I just in shock? Because there are some guys who are just like really cool and say, yeah, we just have to reduce a little, and Germany's on a good way. And then there are so many others who say, oh no, we just have to like kind of have a revolution in the next 8 years. And I was like, okay, it's physics. So like, where is the difference, or isn't there really a big difference? And then I just did a lot of research, talking to scientists and try to find out where this gap comes from in the communication. And it's really also a lot of emotional distancing in scientists, I would say. That is a part of the problem. Then there's a like really huge problem about the myth of positive climate communication, like telling good stories and not realizing that not everybody just understood how bad the situation is, and telling the good stories just makes people believe, okay, there is some solution possible, so somebody will just go and fix this for me. So it's not the case, and stuff like this. So I really try to get very clear where the situation is, and I got feedback from a lot of scientists that this is a really good summary, so if you're interested. Then I would say, like, wherever you work, I mean, the change we need won't happen if people don't start doing it, right? And what is important to not just stay there where you said it already, like not think about, okay, not buying plastics anymore and what can I do at home, because then you're just going to feel so bad that you're never going to start questioning the structures and the power structures and so on. So you really just, I would recommend everybody who just understood how bad the situation is to go out and start working there where you have some kind of leverage that is bigger than your own household. And if everybody just do so, then some change might be possible. But if not, and we're just like waiting for other people to do it, then we're just gonna dive into the catastrophe, and I'm not willing to do so. And I hope most people are not as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. I think we still got time for one or two final sentences.
I'm just thinking about the word eco-anxiety now. We're at a stage where young people are wondering what the future looks like, what jobs of tomorrow would look like, whether it's even worth going to school, it's worth having babies, or they're even wondering whether pension schemes are still going to be able to support it. There's a lot of anxiety. It's not just with young people, but with everybody. And at the risk of sounding a bit alarmist, there's no mistake here. The climate problem is very real, and it is a lot bigger than is being told. I need to state this very clearly. We're not able to adequately articulate the magnitude of this problem. Now, having said that, the response is not freezing and getting overwhelmed. The response is in being very deliberate about what needs to be done and about what your role is. So as well as us changing our own behaviors or our own lifestyles or our neighbors' lifestyles and our dogs' lifestyles, what we need to do is very actively use the luxury that we have. And it's not the kind of luxury that you're imagining. Those of us who are in over-consuming societies, who are in the top 10%, globally. And by the way, if you earn more than 40,000 euros, you are in the global top 10%. That's what it means. Those of us who are in this top 10% also happen to have the luxury of living in democratic countries. It means that you can vote. It means that you have government and institutions that should respond to your voice. That is a luxury which most of those people suffering the consequences in primarily southern countries do not have. Use it. Push your politicians, push your businesses, push your mayors, push them until something happens. Not the day after tomorrow, but tomorrow.
Thank you very much. I think that was a wonderful final statement. So I would like to thank all three of you very much for sharing your experiences and opinions on the topic. I think it was quite eye-opening, at least for me. If you would like to learn more on the topic, we are going to host a workshop just right there in the red box in about 30 minutes. So feel free to join us. We're looking forward to seeing many of you there. And also, I hope to see many of you in October for the Human Rights Film Festival Berlin, where we will also talk again about storytelling and the climate crisis. So yeah, I think we have come to the end of the session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And a big round of applause for Lydia as well, please.